came about, this book came about in one of those strange ways that happen to us in the spiritual work. Some years ago, one of our students went through class in San Francisco and decided very enthusiastically to be a booster for the Infinite Way and to spread the word, and filled a trunk with Infinite Way books and came to Australia. And she found a very, very great lack of welcome. Nobody was interested in the message of the Infinite Way. She just didn't find anybody who had heard about it or who was interested in hearing about it. And so she left Australia very much discouraged and feeling that she was a failure. But she thought that she must be a success somewhere, so she took a steamer for South Africa. And then she wrote me that she was just as great a failure in South Africa because nobody was interested in South Africa. And I must tell you this, that she was a great success in both places. But like many, she didn't wait for the fruitage of her success to come. She planted her seeds and sort of expected that apples would grow on the trees by the next morning, forgetting that in our present experience it is sometimes 4 months until the harvest. But the books that she took with her and the few people that she contacted resulted in quite a large number of students in Melbourne finding the Infinite Way, and then through that eventually other cities. And her success in South Africa was even more dramatic, because whereas she felt that nobody there was interested, the owner of a bookshop, which incidentally probably is the largest bookshop in South Africa, and the buyer of the other bookshop both became so interested in the message that when I came to South Africa, I found 800 people waiting to hear the message of the Infinite Way, and she thought she was a failure. Now, you know that there's a lesson in that for us. We take hold of a teaching, and because we don't see the fruitage today or tomorrow, or get the healing that we expected, or get it in the way that we expected, we also think that we are failing in our work when we may be achieving our greatest success. I remember at a time when my business was falling off that I went to a practitioner for help, and a very good practitioner. And instead of my business increasing, it decreased. And I thought, well, this is the one time this practitioner is falling down. So I went to a second one, and my business went still further downhill. Altogether, I went to 5, but by the time I finished with the 5, I didn't have any business. And I really felt that I was failing. I really felt that they were failing in making the demonstration. To me, it looked like a complete failure of truth to stand up. But one day, my associate in the business world said, you know, I think that you ought to wake up. You're fast asleep. Well, just tell me in what way? Well, he says, you've had 22 telephone calls today, and not one of them from a customer, all from people who'd like healing. Don't you think you ought to go into practice and leave this business world? And that was the day that I left the business world and went into the practice. And you know, the minute I started in the practice, that supply that had been rolling away from me began to roll back in. I like to think always of the story of Joseph in the Old Testament. He is one of my very favorite boyfriends. And the reason is that he was the favored son of a very rich man. And according to natural history, he should have gone on being a no account, no good, nothing, enjoying the riches of his father, amounting to nothing and accomplishing nothing in life, and probably dying as just a name in Scripture of another character that did nothing. But evidently that wasn't his fate, because he was thrown into a pit and sold into slavery. You know, if we were looking on, and more especially if we thought he was a truth student, we'd say, well, I don't think truth works so good for Joseph. That's not a very good demonstration from son of a wealthy man to being sold into slavery in Egypt. That looks like very bad demonstration, but it was good demonstration, very good. Because in finding himself in Egypt, he had the opportunity to prove his mettle, and he became an important man in this royal household. And of course, if we'd been watching that demonstration, we'd say, now he's making a really good demonstration. But it wasn't. It was a very bad demonstration, getting to be so important, because he ended up being thrown into prison this time. And he stayed in prison 2 years. We're told he was innocent also. That would even be a poorer demonstration. It's bad enough for a truth student who's guilty to go to prison, but for one who's innocent to go, now that really represents failure. But not in Joseph's case. In Joseph's case, the 2 years in prison represented his success, because during those 2 years he had nothing to do but meditate and learn the secret of supply. And so when he came out of prison, he knew so much about supply that he was able to save the entire nation of Egypt. And not only that, but to give us a good lesson in what is and what is not demonstration, because when his brothers came to him with a guilty conscience, he was able to say to them, you didn't do this to me, God did. God sent me before you into Egypt. And so while you may have meant it for evil, God meant it for good, and good has come out of it. And so he bore no ill feelings toward his brothers, and as a matter of fact, he fed them and sent plenty of food home to those who needed it. Now you know that there are 3 ways of looking at life. They're all legitimate. One is a material way of life, one is a mental way of life, and one is a spiritual way of life. There are 3 planes of consciousness, and no one has the right to say that any one of those is wrong. But we do have the right, with what we know, to say that they are progressive steps leading up to the highest, which is the kingdom of God. Now there are people at this present time, in this present world, who not only live on the physical plane of life, but at the present time this is the only plane that they can understand or demonstrate, and they should really stay there. Some of them are making grave mistakes by trying to reach the mental plane or the spiritual plane, when absolutely an aspirin tablet will do more for them than all the metaphysical treatments in the world. It is because that is their present level of life. They don't know anything different than the law of the jungle, or the weapons of flesh, or the remedies of materiality, and they don't seem able to respond to them. I presume that the story may have been in your paper. It was in First, the story of this boy who has cancer of the eyes and is being operated. And now his father is a Baptist minister. And so you would think that he's on the spiritual plane and that he has some contact with God and so forth and so on. But you only have to read the story to see that he's one of those that I'm referring to that is still on the material plane. He hasn't even advanced to the mental. Because although he is a Christian minister, he turns to the old Hebrew Testament to find an alibi why his son isn't being healed. You would think he'd be searching the New Testament to find ways and means of salvation, but no, he turns to the Old Testament and there finds an alibi why his son isn't getting well. Now, if you were to tell that man about the Spirit of God, or say to him that the same Spirit that raised Jesus Christ from the dead will quicken also your mortal bodies, he wouldn't believe that because he's steeped in the Old Testament and thinks he's a Christian. Now then, there are people who have advanced beyond the material plane and have come into a mental plane of life, a plane where thoughts are things. And they learn how to use that power of thought to create things. And for a while it really works, for some of them at least. You'd be surprised very often to find that they are not ready for the spiritual plane of life, that they cannot go any further than using truth or using the mind or using thoughts as if they were greater than God. And so their level of experiences, for the time being at least, is mental. Now there is a third plane, and that is the spiritual plane. Of this, Jesus said, the way is straight and narrow, and few there be that enter. And the reason is that the spiritual plane of life is the most difficult to achieve. It demands of us a greater sacrifice than either the physical or the mental. In fact, the physical and the mental don't require sacrifices. They promise to add things to us. The spiritual plane promises to take things from us. It says, first of all, that you must sell all that you have when you find the spiritual pearl in order to buy it. You can't get it for nothing. It isn't a place where truth is free. It isn't a place where you can buy truth with nickels and dimes and shillings. It's a place where you have to sell all that you have in order to get the pearl. You have to part with some of the most, those things that are most dear to you in all the world in order to achieve it. As a matter of fact, it says this, that you may have to leave your mother and your brother and your sister and your father and your husband and your wife in order to follow this. Very definitely it says, leave your nets. I wonder if you know the depth of the meaning of that statement, leave your nets. You would know it if you have ever lived in a fishing village or a fishing town where everybody earns their livelihood with their nets, where their nets become more valuable to them than even the roof over their head. They'd sooner part with their homes than with their nets, and they'll take better care mending their nets than they will in mending their homes, because the nets spell to them life. It's the nets that bring in the fish, and it's the fish that bring in the dollars, and it's the dollars that bring in all the other things that are needed. And so the most thing to watch out for is your nets. Hang on to that beyond everything else, because that means your livelihood. And yet the Master, speaking to fishermen, said, leave your nets. And that's a hard blow for a fisherman to hear, leave your nets. He said things even harder than that. He told the Hebrews, to whom the Holy Temple in Jerusalem was probably the most sacred thing in their lives, that no longer were they to worship there. That they were to worship in spirit and in truth. And when you try to take, in those old days, that temple of Jerusalem away from them, you're taking their heart's blood, because 3 times they had built the temple and 3 times witnessed it destroyed. And they had given their life's blood each time to rebuild it. And they had a law that you weren't going to get into heaven if you didn't get there at least once a year. And here's this great big holy temple where everybody has to go, and their rabbi says to them, no more shall you worship in that holy temple, but in spirit and in truth. He was cutting their heart right out of them when he said that, just as he was telling the fishermen that you've got to give up your living in order to follow the Christ. So it is that at first, the spiritual way of life would seem to deprive us of many of the things that in the physical and mental way of life we're trying to attain. Most of the world is trying to gain more of that which it already has. More money, more homes, more yachts, more leisure. And the spiritual way of life says that you have to work harder for less. There never has been a worker in the spiritual vineyard who could go on a 5-day week and 6 hours a day. Their work is 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. And they're fortunate if a few of those hours are left for sleep. The Master reminded us that there are very few workers in the spiritual vineyard. And that's one of the reasons. Now, that at first glance presents a gloomy picture, but so does Joseph's experience. So does the experience of Jesus. There's no gloomier picture in the world than that of Jesus, devoting his life to healing the sick and raising the dead and feeding the multitude, and ending up all alone on a cross. But you see, the Master wasn't promising material wealth or material peace. And he said very distinctly, I came not to bring peace, but a sword. I came to divide households, separate mothers and daughters, fathers and sons. He came proclaiming a spiritual kingdom, not an increase in the material kingdom. He didn't promise that. He promised a spiritual kingdom, and he made it very clear that my kingdom is not of this world. Truth students very often forget that. On the mental plane, it's understandable that they should forget it, because there they're promised the demonstration of more material things and better material things. But students on the spiritual side of life, those who are following spiritual teaching, should not forget this. They should not forget that the spiritual kingdom is not the demonstration of more and better matter, but that the spiritual kingdom is the demonstration of a new state of consciousness, a transforming of the mind, a whole new state of consciousness in which a whole new world opens up. Not the old world improved, but a whole new world. My kingdom is not of this world. I didn't come, the Master says, to improve this world, but to reveal to you another world, right here on earth. You don't have to die to find it. It's right here on earth, but it's another world. It's a spiritual kingdom, and in this spiritual kingdom there are spiritual harmonies. Now then, so that you will know that embarking on a spiritual mission or message or way of life, that it is not the way of asceticism or doing without. He does say this: take no thought for your life, what you shall eat, or what you shall drink, or wherewithal you shall be clothed. Leave those things out of your consideration and stop trying to pray for them or demonstrate them. But, he says, that doesn't mean that you will have to do without them. Your Heavenly Father knoweth that you have need of these things, and it is His good pleasure to give you the kingdom, so that a person who really embarks on a spiritual way of life learns, first of all, that they are to stop the idea of demonstrating things, stop the idea of praying for food and clothing and housing and supply and companionship and so forth. But it doesn't mean that they are to do without them. It means that in turning away from praying for them, it means that in turning to seeking this great kingdom of the Spirit, that these mundane things of life will be added unto us without our having to take thought for them, without our having to demonstrate them, without our having to give a single thought to where they're to come from, or how they're to come, or when. So that the spiritual kingdom leaves us in full possession of all the good things of the so-called human world, probably more even than the others are able to demonstrate. But it brings them to us without effort and without desire and without wasting thought on them or without having any attachment to them. And therein lies one of the secrets of the spiritual life. That the very moment you stop chasing something, it chases you. Only by now, you don't care much whether you have it or not. But you have it. Those who turn to the teaching of the Master, first of all must recognize that he is promising them a spiritual kingdom, a spiritual universe full of spiritual good. And then that he is presenting a formula or a series of formulas of how to attain this spiritual kingdom, which, when we gain it, we will find that even the mundane things of life are supplied to us without the necessity of our taking thought. Now, two things are very important at this point, and one is this: we have no way of knowing when we embark on the path what the spiritual kingdom consists of. We have no way of knowing that. It is so far different from our concept of life as humans that we would have no way of knowing it. It is very much like, let us say, the child. A child of 12 or 13 or 14 could have no possible conception of what married life is like, the home life, the community life of homes. It couldn't possibly conceive of that because its mind at that particular time knows only about toys and books and schools and playgrounds and flying kites and having dolls. And so it has no conception at all of the joys, of the pleasures, of the privileges of a home and of two people who have come together solely because of their love for each other and the desire to serve each other and the desire to share with each other. Children have no knowledge, no awareness of that. That's a realm beyond their comprehension, and that's why we have, especially in the young years, so many wrecks in married life, because so few young people come to marriage understanding what it's all about. They are still living in the plane of life where they are getting everything, and marriage is more like a toy in which they're going to get some more things. And so they do not realize that marriage isn't a getting, it's a giving and a sharing, and sometimes a sacrificing and a serving. And so they make shipwreck of marriage because they do not know the real nature of it. People of more mature years are more apt to make a success of marriage because by that time they have learned that it isn't just another playground. So it is that we as humans who may have some idea of the pleasures of having a lot of money, or who may know the pleasures of having a healthy body, we still have no concept of the greater things that are included in the spiritual kingdom, and so it becomes necessary to grow into that. Then, spiritual students often embark on this path without a full knowledge of the laws governing the attaining of that mind which was in Christ Jesus. And they often believe that by reading certain books or hearing lectures or going to classes, that is all that is necessary for attaining the kingdom of God, and actually speaking, those are the lesser things. They're minor things. They're necessary, but they're lesser and they're minor. The attainment of the spiritual kingdom is possible only to those who embark on the mission with the full understanding that the responsibility rests solely with them and not with teachers or teachings. The teachers and teachings are only aids on the path, but that the living of the spiritual message by them, the practice of certain rules and regulations that have been laid down by the mystics of the world, and in our case more especially the Master Christ Jesus, that the fulfilling of those teachings, those rules and regulations, alone make possible the entry into the spiritual kingdom or the spiritual state of consciousness. Now then, in the human world you will hear that these teachings of Jesus Christ are impractical and that they cannot be applied to our daily living. Well, there are some of us who can bear witness to the fact that this is not true, that the teachings of Jesus Christ are so practical that when they are applied to the human life, they make the human life practical, successful, harmonious, joyous, profitable, and helpful. That's a very difficult thing to get the world to believe this. And that is why in a work like ours, we do not advertise. We do not seek followers. We make no effort whatsoever to reach the world. The reason is that we have discovered that if we tried it, it would fail. It cannot be done. The spiritual life is meant only for those who are prepared by some previous experience to live that life, and they themselves are seekers, and they will find. When a person is ready for the spiritual life, they will find their spiritual teacher or their spiritual teaching, and they will be led into it. If we go out into the world to try to give this to the world, we end up by being persecuted and prosecuted and crucified. There is no use of advertising. It would be possible with a little promotion work to have here in Adelaide, we will say, 300 people hear me talk. It would only take a little promotion to do it. But I can assure you that out of the 300, the only ones who would hear the message are those who have been drawn here without the promotion work. In other words, those who would be drawn by the promotion work would not be drawn by the message or for the message, but usually for the loaves and fishes which often are promised to accompany the message. The Master had that experience very often, once when he fed the multitude by miracles. And the very next day, they followed him across the lake. And he asked them, "What are you here for?" "Well, this is another day. We're hungry again." So you came not for the miracle, but for the loaves and the fishes. Yesterday I showed you the miracle. Why aren't you demonstrating your own loaves and fishes today? Oh no, they weren't interested in the miracle. They were interested in those loaves and fishes. And what they would have liked was for the Master to have set up free food kitchens all across the Holy Lands, and they wouldn't have had to bother to learn the lessons or to practice the truth. And I suppose that they would have enjoyed if he had set up healing clinics all across the healing lands, the Holy Land, so that they wouldn't have had to learn this principle. They would have just gone to the clinic and had the practitioner say a prayer or give them a treatment, and they could have gone home and gone back to their bridge games or their television sets if they'd have had them, or what the equivalent was in those days. And so it is today. You can find big audiences, if you want them, to come to hear about spiritual truth, but you will usually find that they are made up of those who would like to have the loaves and fishes spread out for them, or have you do all their healing work for them, and not put them to too much trouble, except listening to you or probably reading a few pages of a book every day. Now actually, you will not find in the Master's message as given in the New Testament, you will not find any promises of an easy way. You will hear the promise of a way that is straight and narrow, and few there be that enter. And you will hear not of coming and getting truth free, but of selling all that you have to buy this precious pearl. And so you gain a whole new concept of what truth is, of what the spiritual way is, of what the spiritual way of living is. And you then say, what are the rewards of that way of life? And then a spiritual teacher must be truthful and say to you, there are none, and you shouldn't enter that way of life. Because those who ask that question haven't yet had the spiritual discernment to know the rewards, or that there are rewards, and therefore they wouldn't be ready for it. To those who come and are already aware of the fact that there is a spiritual kingdom, that entering that spiritual kingdom one finds spiritual glories, and in finding the spiritual glories also find that the necessary human things of life are added, to those there is a readiness for a spiritual message. Now, a spiritual message requires a sacrifice in its earliest stages, because the first thing that we're called upon to sacrifice is many of our previous conceptions of God, of prayer, and of the way to attain spiritual freedom. Everybody in the course of their lives builds up certain misconceptions. Some of those are attained in the Orthodox Church, and a person has to have great courage, if they have been brought up in an Orthodox church, to be able to drop those misconceptions and be prepared for a higher revelation. Sometimes it takes a great sacrifice even to believe that there is a higher revelation than the Orthodox Church. You must remember, of course, that this is nothing new. Jesus the Christ was a Hebrew rabbi, and he preached in the Hebrew synagogues. And yet, through a way that you will learn in the next few years, a way that is not yet too publicly known, he received the light of a higher spiritual revelation than the Hebrew church knew anything about. Now, he didn't set out to found a new religion. There was no Christian religion until 300 years after the crucifixion. So he had nothing to do with the founding of a Christian church. what he sought to do was to reform the Hebrew church. He set out to change the errors of the Hebrew church and to lift it up. As you, in these coming years, become more acquainted with these manuscripts that are now being translated, you will learn that Jesus Christ was the master of the Essenes movement, that the Essenes movement was a spiritual Hebrew movement, but a Hebrew movement that no longer had faith in the ceremonies, rituals, and rites of the Hebrew church. They did not believe in sacrifices. They did not believe that only priests could be spiritual, or rabbis. And so they led a spiritual life, community life, among themselves. Probably not as completely on our line of thought as we would like, but they embraced many of the things that we follow. And Jesus was the head of that movement. And its purpose was actually to fight and to reform the Hebrew church. That is why he said to them, "No longer shall you worship in that holy temple with its sacrifices and dove selling and money changing and so forth and so on, but you must worship in spirit and in truth." Well, of course, he was crucified for his pains. Well, in the same way, a man named Ingersoll, in the 19th century, went out on the platform to preach that all of this nonsense about hell and heaven as actual physical places isn't true, and there is no damnation for the human race, but it isn't embraced any teaching of damnation in Jesus' teaching as such. And of course he was persecuted for his efforts, but the result has been that 3/4 of the Protestant churches on earth have dropped those old heaven and hell teachings and those eternal damnation teachings and modernized them. In the same way, in her day, Mrs. Eddy tried to add spiritual healing to the Protestant church, and she says that I had hoped that I would never have to found a church. I hoped that the churches now in existence would adopt spiritual healing as a restatement or reinstatement of the Master's teaching, but they wouldn't. And so she founded a church to give the world some inkling of spiritual healing. And what was the result of that? A magazine article last month tells us that 33 Protestant denominations are now adding spiritual healing to their teachings. And last year, the Church of England called a conference in England and invited all of the best-known spiritual healers at present in the world to consult with them and to give them the benefit of their experience in spiritual healing. And they appointed a committee which is to operate for 10 years and then to bring in a report for the Church of England on the subject of spiritual healing and how to accomplish it. So you see that what started out also as a rebellion against the Orthodox Church, if you want to call Mrs. Eddy's work that, has turned out to be a new addition to the Protestant Church, and the day is coming, be assured of this, the day is coming when every Protestant church in the world will be engaging in spiritual healing. More of them would be doing it now, except that they don't know how to go about it. They are under this handicap. there are only, I'm speaking now of the days before the Infinite Way, there were only 3 books on spiritual healing that might be said to have been practical. One of them was Science and Health, which of course, in order to be brought up to date, needs a great deal of revision to remove the mental aspects of it from the spiritual. But even as it stands, it is without doubt the best that the world has had on spiritual healing. Then, second to that, is Emily Cady's Lessons in Truth, which is entirely built on and around Science and Health. There is nothing original, there is nothing in Emily Cady's book that doesn't originate from Science and Health. But it leaves out some aspects that were in Science and Health, and it becomes a very good basic book for spiritual healing. It is only a beginner's book, but it is basic, and to that extent it is good. And then in the Divine Science, you have spiritual healing, and I'm not familiar enough with it to know what degree of spiritual healing can be accomplished through it, but I do know that it also had its beginning with Christian Science, and that to some extent it presents spiritual healing aspects, and those are the only 3 books up until the Infinite Way that really have had and still have any value as textbooks on spiritual healing. Now, the church can't accept any of those, because if it were to accept Science and Health, it would be accepting the Christian Science Church. If it were to accept Emily Cady, it would be accepting unity. If it were to accept Divine Science, it would be accepting Divine Science, and it can't do that. It just can't say we're wrong and they're right. And so they're handicapped in that they have no textbook to turn to, and they are devoting all of their time to this psychological healing, which they call spiritual healing, and which has no more resemblance to spiritual healing than salt has to sugar. But at least for them, it's a beginning. For them, at least, it's an acknowledgement that there is something higher than medicines and surgery. And so it is a starting point, and eventually they will be able to find a textbook that will not force them to accept somebody's religion. Some of them are accepting the Infinite Way. And the reason is that the Infinite Way is not identified with any religion or any religious movement or any religious organization. And so in using the Infinite Way textbook, they can do it without saying, well, here is a religion that's right and we're wrong. They can adopt the principles of it without, if they like, they can even drop the words Infinite Way. We don't care whether anybody uses that term or whether they don't, because it just happens to be a combination of 2 words that my publisher put onto the title of the book. It wasn't even my title. So I care little whether anyone mentions the Infinite Way. All I care about is that those interested in the subject of spiritual healing and spiritual living should find in that book principles by which to live. But I can tell you now that all of the principles that are in that book are in this book, the Bible. I haven't added anything to the Infinite Way teaching that isn't found in the Bible. But I have been bold enough to accept some of the Bible teaching as literal teachings and recommend their use literally and not figuratively, literally and not merely metaphorically. And so it is that when some of our friends in the Orthodox Church come to the infinite way, they are shocked at first at some of the things that are in there until they learn that they were originally in the New Testament and had been overlooked. And then they find that they can accept the very things that heretofore they have rejected. Now, some of those things can also be found in science and health, or in divine science, or in unity, but the point is that they would have to acknowledge a correctness of another religion, and that's the point. You can't expect them to do that. That wouldn't be part of human nature. So that I sum up now with just these two things. The infinite way is not another way of using truth in order to demonstrate homes, marriages, divorces, parking spaces, supply, and so forth and so on. It is rather a giving up of oneself so that truth can use an individual. We don't use this truth. We learn how to surrender ourselves so that truth can use us. And we make no attempt through this work to demonstrate anything, but rather demonstrate anything other than a consciousness of God, and then let the mundane things of this life be added unto us. Now that's the object and work of the message of the infinite way, and the method of achieving it is through, first of all, certain rules and regulations that are laid down in this book, the Bible. Some few of them in the Old Testament by some of the great wise Hebrew leaders, most of them in the New Testament laid down by Christ Jesus, and a few of them by Paul. All of them, of course, revealed by John in the Gospel of John. To that has been added one thing, not an original thing, the art of meditation. In the work of the infinite way, meditation is one of our major activities. And I don't mean merely mental work, and I don't mean entering the silence. I really mean an art of meditation, an art that takes time, effort, labor to attain, except in the experience of those born mystics who come into this world with the knowledge of inner communion. But for all the rest, including myself, I might tell you, meditation is work. My own work consisted not only of years of research, but 8 months of practice before I attained the first tiny drop of measure of success. Now, our students do not, as a rule, have to suffer those 8 months that I suffered. First place, they don't have to do any of the research work. That's all done. Nor do they have to suffer those 8 months, because my 8 months revealed ways whereby they could save themselves much of those 8 months. Secondly, my own consciousness lifts them up. I, if I be lifted up, shall draw all men unto me. In our work in the United States, Canada, and England, Holland and Sweden, and now beginning South Africa and Australia, we never begin classwork without 15 minutes of meditation conducted by one of my students who has accomplished their communion with God. Very fortunately, in every city where we function, there is at least one such student, and in many cases, many, many more than one, capable of conducting a meditation. When such a student conducts a meditation, it is an easy thing for everybody in the room to meditate. They are automatically lifted by the consciousness of the one conducting the meditation. Now, I shouldn't say everyone, that is not quite true, but the vast majority of those in the room. Perhaps we will have the opportunity before today or tomorrow is over to have such a meditation, so that you can see how much easier it is to attain a degree of meditation when someone is conducting it who has attained it. Then you will find why I, if I be lifted up, shall draw all men unto me, why it is that one person in meditation can make it easier for others. But that is not going to relieve them of their own responsibility, because they still have to keep practicing until they attain it themselves. It only means that it's going to be something shorter than 8 months and something less than the original labor that was involved with me and my earlier students. I think that about sums up what I can tell you about the object of the Infinite Way and its method of approach. I might add just one thing. There is no Infinite Way organization. There is no Infinite Way religion. There is no Infinite Way membership. Nobody in all of this world belongs to the Infinite Way. Nobody. Nobody can join it, and nobody can leave it. I have had students once in a while come to me and say, I have decided to leave the Infinite Way. And I've had to say to them, I'm sorry, but you can't. You didn't join it. We don't have anybody join the Infinite Way or become a member of it for this reason. The Infinite Way is merely a presentation of a spiritual way of life. I have seen it demonstrated that a person who seriously wants to lead the spiritual way of life can do it whether or not they belong to a church or whether or not they remain in it or leave it. I have the very great pleasure of having 12 Protestant ministers who are most wonderful students of the Infinite Way. I have the great joy of having 2 Hebrew rabbis who are deep, deep students and fine, fine livers of the Infinite Way, and good teachers of it, too, in the Hebrew synagogue. And 1 Catholic bishop. So you see, and of course, I don't have to tell you how many Christian Science practitioners and teachers are very fine students of this work without leaving the church, or how many Unity students or how many other students have done it. The Reverend Gregg has been one of our very ardent friends since the very beginning of the Infinite Way, without leaving divine science, because there's nothing to leave it for, so far as joining anything is concerned. It is a way of life. One can adopt it wherever they are, in whatever way they wish. On the other hand, we must always be prepared for this, that since the Infinite Way does give us a conscious communion and living with God, that to many it makes church work, church attendance,